You ever get that weird gut feeling that something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it?
That was me.
I'm Scott, and I thought everything was good with Jessie, my wife of 3 years. We met at some crappy dive bar, both too drunk to remember who approached first. Fast forward a few years, we're married, sharing a small house in a quiet neighborhood, and I honestly thought we were the kind of couple that would make it through anything. But lately, Jessie had changed. It started slow. You know how it goes. She'd be more quiet than usual, zoning out during conversations, glued to her phone way more than before. I figured she was stressed with work or something. But as days turned into weeks, I couldn't ignore it. She wasn't just distant, it felt like she was slipping away. I remember asking her one night, "Hey Jess, you good? You've been kinda off lately." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired, Scott. Work's been crazy." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then weird stuff started happening. She'd be out late running errands, or I'd wake up at night, and she wouldn't be in bed. I'd find her in the living room, scrolling her phone with this guilty look on her face like she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to.
At first, I brushed it off.
Hell, I was probably overreacting, right?
She wasn't the cheating type.
She was Jessie, my Jessie, and we'd been through so much together. We'd gone through the crappy apartments, the dead-end jobs, the times we could barely afford rent. We had history. She wouldn't just throw that away, would she? One day, I came home early from work, and that's when things started to unravel. The house was quiet, too quiet. I called out for her, but no answer. I wandered into the kitchen, and that's when I saw it, her phone, left on the counter unlocked. The screen lit up with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Can't wait to see you tonight."
Same place. I froze.
My heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. Who the hell was texting her? I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. I picked up the phone and opened the thread. The messages were worse than I could have imagined. Flirty, intimate texts, late-night meetups.
And the worst part? It was our neighbor.
You know that moment when your whole world feels like it's crumbling beneath you?
Yeah, that was me.
Our neighbor, Greg. The guy I drank beers with during Sunday football, the guy who helped me fix the leaky sink a few months back. Jessie had been sneaking around with him, right under my nose. I wanted to scream, punch something, but all I could do was sit there, staring at her phone like it was some kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. How long had this been going on? How many times had I been played for a fool, sitting in the same room with them, oblivious to the betrayal happening right under my feet? That night, I didn't say anything.
I couldn't.
I needed to think, to figure out how the hell to confront her without completely losing my mind. But that text, it haunted me.
Same place.
Where the hell was this same place? I knew I had to find out. The next day, I took the day off work. Jessie left the house like usual, telling me she had some errands to run. I waited a few minutes and then followed her. I stayed back, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't notice me. She drove across town, past her usual spots, and ended up at a motel, one of those sleazy no-name places people use when they don't want to be found. I parked a block away and watched as she got out of the car. And then, like some messed-up joke, Greg pulled up. They hugged in the parking lot, and then, without hesitation, they walked inside together. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the entrance to that motel, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But one thing was clear. Jessie was cheating, and she didn't even care enough to hide it anymore. I drove home after seeing them together, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought it might snap. My mind was a mess. Every happy memory with Jessie was now tainted, rewritten in my head. Every kiss, every laugh, every lazy Sunday morning. It was like I was watching some alternate version of my life, one where everything was a lie. I got home and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. What the hell was I supposed to do?
Confront her? Scream at her?
Maybe I could pretend I didn't know, let her keep going while I figured out a plan. But that just felt pathetic. There was no going back from this. The thing that stung the most was Greg. That dude was supposed to be my friend. We'd had countless barbecues, hung out watching games, even went fishing once. How many times had he smiled in my face, knowing he was sneaking behind my back with my wife? I sat there for hours, trying to wrap my head around it all. The anger was boiling inside me, but I didn't want to lose control.
I couldn't. Not yet.
I needed to figure out how long this had been going on, how deep this betrayal really went. So I did the one thing I never thought I'd do, I snooped. Jessie's phone was still where I'd left it, and now that I knew her little secret, I didn't feel bad about going through it. I started looking through her messages with Greg.
They went back months. Months.
They weren't just hooking up on a whim. This was an affair, like a full-blown relationship that they'd been hiding from me. The texts ranged from cute, flirty banter to straight-up raunchy, explicit messages. I felt sick reading them, but I couldn't stop. It was like a train wreck. I didn't want to see it, but I couldn't look away.
And the worst part? She seemed happier with him.
The way she talked to him, the emojis, the little pet names, it was like she was a different person. The Jessie I knew or thought I knew was gone. There was one message that stuck out though. It was from about a week ago. Greg had texted her, "Do you think he knows?" And Jessie replied, "Nah, he's clueless. Scott never pays attention to this kind of stuff. He's too wrapped up in his own world." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I had noticed something was off, but I ignored it because I trusted her. I trusted her completely, and she used that trust to lie to my face. That night, when Jessie came home, she acted like nothing was wrong. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day was, and then went to make dinner. I just stood there watching her, trying to understand how she could lie so easily. How she could pretend everything was normal when she was sneaking around with our neighbor behind my back. I didn't say anything that night, or the next day. I don't know why, but I guess I was still in shock. Or maybe I just didn't know how to confront her without completely blowing up. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I couldn't keep quiet forever. I had to do something. A few days later, I finally snapped. Jessie was in the kitchen, making breakfast like it was just another day. I walked in trying to keep my voice calm, but it was shaking. "So, how's Greg?" She froze, the spatula in her hand hovering over the pan. She didn't turn around, but I could see her shoulders tense up. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice way too casual. "I mean, how's Greg?" I repeated, louder this time.
"You know, our neighbor.
The guy you've been screwing behind my back." She turned to face me, her eyes wide. For a split second, I thought she was going to deny it, to come up with some ridiculous excuse.
But she didn't.
She just stood there, staring at me, like a deer caught in headlights. "How long, Jessie?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How long have you been cheating on me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she was trying to find the right words. But there weren't any right words, not for this. Finally, she whispered, "It's not what you think." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh.
It was bitter, hollow.
"Not what I think."
"Really?"
"Because I'm pretty sure you've been sneaking around with Greg for months. I'm pretty sure you've been lying to my face every single day." She started to cry, and I wanted to feel bad for her, but I couldn't.
"Not this time.
Not after everything." "Scott, I'm sorry," she said through her tears. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I shook my head, disbelief flooding over me. "How does something like this just happen, Jessie? You don't just trip and fall into bed with the neighbor." She didn't have an answer for that. Instead, she just kept crying, apologizing over and over again. But it didn't matter.
The damage was done.
I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't unhear those texts or unfeel the betrayal. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, sobbing. I needed space, needed air. I grabbed my keys and left the house, not sure where I was going, but knowing I couldn't stay there.
Not with her.
After I stormed out, I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. The city blurred by as I thought about everything that had happened. It was like my brain was on overload, replaying every memory with Jessie, every moment I missed the signs, every excuse she gave that I just accepted without question. I ended up at this old park we used to hang out at when we first started dating. Back when everything was simple, when I still believed she was as all in as I was. I sat on one of those beat-up wooden benches, staring out at the swing set, watching some kid push himself higher and higher, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. I envied that kid. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and for a split second, I thought about ignoring it. But then I saw it was Jessie calling, and I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. I let it ring a few times before picking up.
"Scott."
Her voice was soft, shaky, like she'd been crying non-stop since I left.
"Good. She should feel bad."
"What do you want, Jessie?" I asked, my voice flat. I didn't have the energy for this.
"Please can you come home?
We need to talk."
I scoffed.
"Oh, now you want to talk? You didn't feel like talking when you were sneaking off to screw Greg, did you?" She was quiet for a second, and I could hear her trying to hold back more tears. "I know I messed up.
I know, okay?
But I don't want to lose you.
Can we just talk, please? I'll explain everything." Explain everything.
Like there was some magical explanation that would make me feel better about her cheating on me with the guy who lived right next door. But the truth was, I needed answers. I needed to understand how we got here. So, after a long pause, I finally said, "Fine. I'm coming back." The drive home felt longer than it should have. My stomach was in knots the whole time, dreading whatever Jessie was going to say. When I pulled up to the house, I sat in the car for a minute, just staring at it. This was our home, the place we built together, and now it felt like a prison I didn't want to walk back into. But I had to. When I walked inside, Jessie was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked small, fragile, like she was waiting for me to break her apart with one wrong word. Part of me wanted to yell and scream and make her feel the pain I was feeling. But I couldn't do it. I didn't have the energy for that kind of fight. I sat down in the armchair across from her, putting as much distance between us as I could in the small living room. "All right, Jess," I said, leaning back, crossing my arms.
Talk.
She took a deep breath, looking down at her hands as she fidgeted with her wedding ring. "It didn't start the way you think," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first, it was just flirting, I guess.
Harmless.
We'd see each other outside, and he'd make a joke or compliment me, and I didn't think anything of it.
But then, I don't know.
I started looking forward to those little moments. And one day, it just escalated."
Escalated.
I repeated, my voice cold. "That's a nice way of saying you started sleeping with him."
She winced but nodded. "Yeah. I'm not going to lie to you anymore, Scott. I did.
And it was wrong, I know that. But it wasn't. I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, congratulations," I said sarcastically.
Mission accomplished."
She started crying again, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen enough of her tears by now to know they didn't change anything. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, wiping at her eyes. "I've been so lost lately. I don't even know why I did it."
"I love you, Scott. I do. But
what?"
I snapped.
"You just needed something different? You got bored with me." She shook her head, but I could tell she didn't have a real answer.
"I don't know."
"I don't know why I did it." I sat there for a moment, letting her words hang in the air between us. The silence was heavy, uncomfortable, and I could feel the weight of everything crashing down on me. She didn't even know why she did it. That was the worst part. It wasn't because I had done something wrong, or because there was some huge issue in our marriage that we couldn't fix.
She just did it. Because she could.
Because she wanted to. "So, what now?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. "What do we do?"
"I don't know," she whispered again.
"I don't want to lose you, Scott."
"I don't.
But I can't undo what I did. All I can do is tell you how sorry I am and hope you'll give me a chance to make it right." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see the woman I fell in love with. I saw a stranger. Someone who had lied to me, betrayed me, and was now sitting there, asking me to forgive her like it was that simple. But it wasn't. It would never be that simple again. "I need time," I said, standing up. I can't just forgive this, Jessie. Not right now." She nodded, tears streaming down her face.
"I understand."
I didn't say anything else. I grabbed my keys again and walked out the door, not sure where I was going, but knowing I couldn't stay in that house.
Not with her.
Not after everything. After I left, I drove to a bar on the other side of town. It wasn't the usual spot where Greg and I used to grab drinks. There was no way in hell I was going anywhere near that place. I needed somewhere unfamiliar, somewhere I could disappear for a bit and not have to think about Jessie, Greg, or this whole mess. I ordered a beer, found a booth in the corner, and sat there, just staring at the bottle. I hadn't even taken a sip when I felt my phone buzz again. I didn't need to check to know it was Jessie. I ignored it.
I couldn't talk to her right now.
Not when I felt like my entire world had been flipped upside down. As I sat there, I started thinking about what my next move should be. Do I try to forgive her? Try to fix what was broken? Or do I walk away and never look back? Both options felt impossible, like there was no real way to win here. A few beers in, I started scrolling through my phone, looking for anything to distract me from the thoughts running through my head. That's when I saw a notification from a group chat I was in with a couple of buddies. We didn't talk much, just sent each other memes and dumb stuff. But that night, there was a message that caught my eye. "Yo, did anyone else see Greg's wife posted some weird stuff on Facebook?" One of them had sent.
My heart skipped a beat.
Greg's wife, Melissa. We weren't close, but she was always around when we had those neighborhood BBQs or get-togethers.
A quiet woman, kind of shy.
I hadn't even considered what she must be going through.
Did she know?
Had she found out about Greg and Jessie? I opened up Facebook, something I hadn't done in forever, and searched for Melissa's profile. Her most recent post was from a few hours ago. It was one of those vague, passive-aggressive posts that made it clear something was wrong without saying exactly what it was. Betrayal cuts the deepest when it comes from those you trust the most, she had written.
Yup. She knew.
I thought about messaging her, asking if she wanted to talk, but then I stopped myself. What was I going to say? Hey, your husband and my wife are screwing each other behind our backs. Want to grab coffee and bond over our mutual pain.
It felt wrong.
Like I was dragging her into my mess when she already had enough to deal with. But then I thought maybe she could help me. Maybe she had more info on this affair than I did. Maybe we could figure out what to do together. I took a deep breath and typed out a quick message. Hey Melissa. I don't know if this is out of line, but I think we need to talk. Call me when you can. I hit send before I could second guess myself and put my phone down, trying not to obsess over whether she'd reply. I didn't have to wait long though. About 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed with her name on the screen. I hesitated for a second, then answered. Hey Scott, she said, her voice shaky, like she'd been crying. I got your message. I think I know why you want to talk.
I sighed.
Yeah, I think you do. There was a long pause on the line before she spoke again. It's Jessie, isn't it?
My stomach clenched. Yeah.
I found out a few days ago. I'm so sorry, Melissa. I had no idea. She let out a bitter laugh.
Don't apologize.
I've known for a while. I just didn't want to believe it. Hearing that hit me like a punch to the gut. She had been living with this knowledge for longer than I had, and yet, she hadn't said a word. How do you carry that kind of burden, knowing your partner is betraying you every day?
How long?
I asked quietly, not sure if I really wanted the answer.
A couple of months, she admitted.
I found some texts on his phone. I confronted him, and he promised it was over. He said it was just a mistake, that he loved me and wanted to make things right.
But, I don't know.
I don't believe him anymore. I closed my eyes, trying to process everything. So Greg had already been caught, and yet they kept going. Jessie had continued the affair, even after Greg promised Melissa it was over. That just made it hurt even more. What are you going to do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper.
I don't know, she replied.
I thought about leaving, but we have the kids. It's not that simple. I felt a pang of guilt. Melissa had more to lose than I did. She had a family, a life built with Greg that went deeper than just the two of them. Walking away wasn't as easy for her as it was for me. I'm sorry you have to go through this, I said, not knowing what else to say.
Yeah, me too, she sighed.
But honestly, I'm more sorry for you. I can't imagine how you must feel right now.
I'm just numb, I admitted.
I don't know what to do. Well, she said after a long pause, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. It helps, you know, knowing someone else understands. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me.
Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate that.
We ended the call shortly after, and I sat there, staring at my phone, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next.
I had no idea.
A few days passed, and I avoided Jessie as much as possible. I stayed in the guest room, barely spoke to her, and threw myself into work just to keep my mind off things. But it was impossible to escape the reality of what was happening. Our marriage was crumbling, and neither of us knew how to fix it. Or if we even wanted to. One night, after another long day of pretending everything was fine, I got a text from Melissa.
We need to talk. I found so meeting. My heart skipped a beat. What had she found? More texts? Pictures?
My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I told her to meet me at the park again, the same one where I'd gone after confronting Jessie. It felt like a safe spot, far away from everything. When she showed up, her face was pale, her eyes red like she hadn't slept in days. She sat down next to me on the bench, her hands shaking as she handed me her phone. Read this, she said, her voice trembling. I took the phone from her, my stomach in knots as I opened the message thread. It was another conversation between Greg and Jessie, but this one was different. It wasn't just flirty texts or plans to meet up. They were talking about me and Melissa. About how to keep us from finding out. About how to cover their tracks. But then, near the end, there was something that made my blood run cold. Jessie, what if Scott finds out? What do we do then? Greg, don't worry. I'll take care of it. Take care of it? What the hell did that mean? I looked up at Melissa, my heart racing. What does he mean by take care of it? She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear.
I don't know.
But I don't like it. I sat there on that park bench, staring at Melissa's phone, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Take care of it. What the hell did that mean? The way it was worded, it felt more like a threat than some vague reassurance. I replayed everything in my mind, wondering if I had missed something more sinister. Was Greg planning something?
Was Jessie in on it?
Suddenly, it wasn't just an affair I was worried about, it was my safety.
Our safety.
Melissa looked just as freaked out as I felt. She bit her lip, hands trembling as she wiped her eyes with her sleeve. Scott, I don't know what to do, she whispered.
Do you think he'd hurt us?
I mean, he's never been violent, but... Her voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in her eyes. It matched the gnawing feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. This was no longer just about betrayal. It felt like something much darker was lurking beneath the surface. I don't know, but we can't just sit here and pretend like this is nothing, I said, my voice shaking. We need to be careful. We sat in silence for a while, trying to wrap our heads around what we just read. Neither of us wanted to jump to conclusions, but at the same time, we couldn't ignore the possibility that Greg might actually be capable of something dangerous. I stood up, pacing in front of the bench, running my hands through my hair. Do you have anyone you can stay with? Like family or friends? I asked.
Melissa shook her head. Not really.
My parents live out of state, and I don't want to drag the kids into this unless I'm sure there's a real threat. I nodded, understanding her hesitation. But at the same time, my instincts were screaming at me to take this seriously. We couldn't afford to be complacent, not when we had no idea what Greg was capable of. We should go to the police, I said, suddenly feeling like it was the only option left. Even if it's just a precaution, we need to report this. Maybe they can help us figure out if there's a real danger. Melissa looked at me with wide eyes, and I could see the conflict in her expression. She didn't want to believe that her husband, the man she'd built a life with, could actually be a threat. But the reality of the situation was starting to sink in for both of us. I think you're right, she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. I'll go with you. We got into our cars and drove to the nearest police station. The whole time, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Greg's truck tailing us, even though I knew he had no reason to suspect anything yet. Paranoia was creeping in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. When we arrived at the station, we sat down with an officer and explained the situation. Melissa handed over her phone, showing them the texts, and I filled in the gaps about what had been happening between Greg and Jessie. The officer took notes, nodding as he listened, but I could tell he wasn't sure how seriously to take us. So, let me get this straight, the officer said, leaning back in his chair. You're concerned that this guy might try to harm you based on this one message? I felt my frustration rising. It's not just the message, I snapped. It's the fact that he's been lying to both of us, sneaking around with my wife, and now he's saying he'll take care of it if we find out. That doesn't sound like nothing to me. The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything for a moment. He glanced down at the message on Melissa's phone again, then back at us. Look, I understand why you're upset. But without more concrete evidence of a threat, there's not much we can do. I can file a report, and we'll keep it on record, but unless he makes a direct threat or takes some kind of action, our hands are tied. I felt like I just hit a brick wall. What were we supposed to do? Just wait around until something bad happened? Melissa must have sensed my frustration because she spoke up, her voice surprisingly steady. We're not asking you to arrest him or anything. We just want to make sure someone knows what's going on.
In case. The officer nodded. Fair enough.
I'll make sure the report is filed. And if anything else happens, anything suspicious at all, call us immediately. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We left the station feeling slightly better, but there was still a heavy tension hanging between us.
This wasn't over. Not by a long shot.
The next few days were weird. Jessie and I were barely speaking, and the tension in the house was suffocating. I started to notice little things that set me on edge. Her phone always seemed to be buzzing, and she was constantly sneaking off into another room to take calls or text someone. I didn't need to ask who it was. But it wasn't just the affair that had me on edge anymore. It was the possibility that something worse was brewing beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was watching, waiting for the right moment to make his move. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard Jessie's phone buzz again. She was in the bathroom, and I couldn't help myself. I grabbed her phone and looked at the screen. It was another message from Greg. Greg, we need to talk. It's getting too risky. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the message. Risky? What was he talking about? I quickly put the phone back where I'd found it and tried to act normal when Jessie came back into the room. But inside, I was panicking. Something was definitely going on, and I needed to figure out what it was. The next day, I met up with Melissa again, and we decided to do something we probably shouldn't have. We started digging. We went through old messages, emails, anything we could find that might give us more information. And that's when we stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. Greg had been looking up flights. One-way tickets.
For 2 people.
I showed Melissa, and her face went pale.
He's planning to run, she whispered. With Jesse.
I felt like I was going to be sick. This whole time, I'd been thinking Greg might be planning something violent, but now it seemed like he was just planning to disappear.
With my wife. Without a trace. The room felt like it was closing in on me. One-way tickets? Was this really happening? The thought of Greg and Jesse running off together, leaving me and Melissa behind, wrecking both of our lives, was almost too much to process. My hands were shaking as I looked at the flight confirmation email Greg had sent to himself. He's actually doing it, Melissa said, her voice barely a whisper. He's going to take her and leave. What the hell are we supposed to do now? I didn't have an answer. Every option felt terrible. I wanted to scream, confront Jesse, and demand to know what the hell was going on, but I also knew that tipping my hand too soon might just push them to leave even faster. We need to stop them, I finally said, my voice hoarse. We can't just let them walk away from this. Not like this. Melissa nodded, her expression grim. But how? If we confront them, they'll deny everything. And if we wait too long, they'll be gone. I sat down, rubbing my temples. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. We couldn't go to the police with this, plane tickets weren't exactly a crime, and without any solid evidence, they'd just dismiss us again. And I couldn't just pack up and leave town myself. This was my life, my house, and I wasn't about to let them destroy it without a fight. We need to make them think we don't know, I said, thinking out loud. I keep playing it cool, act like everything's normal. But we need to be ready. We need to find out when they're planning to leave and catch them before they can make a run for it. Melissa looked skeptical, but she didn't have a better idea. Okay, she said hesitantly. But how do we find out when they're leaving? I thought about it for a second. They're going to have to communicate somehow. We'll need to keep an eye on their messages. If we can get access to Jesse's phone or Greg's emails again, we might be able to figure out the exact date. Melissa frowned. I don't know if I can get into Greg's stuff again. He's been really secretive lately. More than usual. I think he suspects I'm onto him. That's fine, I said, trying to think ahead. I'll focus on Jessie. She's still keeping her phone on her all the time, but maybe I can catch her slipping. Over the next few days, I played the role of the clueless husband, even though every time Jessie smiled at me, it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. She was still acting distant, but she didn't seem to suspect that I knew about the plane tickets, or the fact that she was planning to run off with Greg. I pretended like things were slowly getting better between us, all while keeping my eyes peeled for any hint of when they were planning to leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, I got my chance. Jessie had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went upstairs to take a shower. My heart raced as I picked it up, knowing I only had a few minutes to search for anything that might give me a clue. I unlocked the phone and immediately went to her messages. There it was, a new text from Greg. Greg, I've got everything ready. We leave Friday night. Friday night. That was in 2 days. I took a screenshot of the message and quickly put the phone back where I found it, trying to calm my racing heart. This was it. They were planning to leave in 2 days, and now I had a deadline. I called Melissa as soon as I could, filling her in on what I had found. They're leaving Friday night, I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. We've got 2 days to figure out how to stop them. Melissa was quiet for a moment before speaking. We need a plan, Scott. We can't just show up at the airport and confront them. What if they still manage to get away? I know, I said, pacing around the room. We need to think of something that'll stop them in their tracks. Something they won't see coming. She sighed. Do you think they'll really leave? I mean, would Jessie really abandon everything here? I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe that Jessie wasn't capable of something like this. But after everything I'd found out, I couldn't put anything past her anymore. I don't know, I admitted. But I'm not willing to take that chance. We spent the next few hours tossing around ideas, trying to come up with a way to stop them without tipping them off. It felt like a high-stakes chess game, and we were running out of time. Finally, we came up with a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best we had. We decided to confront Jesse and Greg the morning they were supposed to leave. Not at the airport, that was too risky. Instead, we'd catch them at Greg's place, where they'd be finalizing everything before heading out. Melissa and I would show up together, corner them, and force them to admit what they were planning. We figured that if we confronted them together, they'd have no choice but to come clean. It was a risky plan, but it was the only one that felt right. We needed to see their faces, hear their excuses. Maybe even make them squirm a little before we destroyed whatever fantasy they had of running off together. Friday morning came faster than I expected, and my nerves were shot. Melissa and I had agreed to meet just down the street from Greg's house around 8 a.m., before he and Jesse had a chance to leave. As I sat in my car, waiting for Melissa to arrive, I felt like I was about to throw up. This was the moment everything came crashing down. When Melissa pulled up next to me, she looked just as anxious as I felt. "You ready for this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "And not really," I admitted. But we've got to do it." We got out of our cars and walked toward Greg's house, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see Jesse's car in the driveway, and I knew they were inside, probably making their final preparations. My hands were shaking as I knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door swung open, and there stood Greg, looking shocked to see both of us standing there. Behind him, I could see Jessie, her face pale as she realized what was happening. "Scott? Melissa?" Greg stammered, his eyes darting between us. What are you doing here?" I didn't even give him a chance to explain. We know everything," I said, my voice cold. "About the affair. About the plane tickets. We know you're planning to run off together." Jessie's face went even paler, and I saw her take a step back. Greg looked like a deer caught in the headlights, completely frozen in place. "This ends now," I continued, stepping closer to Greg. "You're not going anywhere. You're going to stand here and tell us the truth, or we'll make sure everyone finds out what you've been up to." Melissa stood beside me, her arms crossed, glaring at Greg like she was ready to tear him apart. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. But before Greg could say anything, Jessie finally spoke up. "Scott, Shut up," I snapped, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear any more of your lies." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a split second, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered everything she had done, every lie, every betrayal, and I pushed the guilt aside. "You were really going to leave me," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You were going to walk out on everything we built, just like that?" Jessie didn't answer. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, as Greg shifted uncomfortably beside her. And that's when everything went sideways.
Before I could even process what was happening, Greg lunged forward, grabbing Jessie by the arm and pulling her behind him like some kind of shield. His face twisted into something I hadn't seen before. Panic, anger, desperation all rolled into one ugly expression. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands?" Greg spat, his voice shaking. "You don't know anything. You're clueless. Both of you." Melissa and I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what was unfolding. This wasn't how I expected things to go. I thought they'd crumble under the weight of their guilt, not explode like this. My heart was pounding so loud in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. I stepped forward, trying to stay calm, but I could feel the heat rising in my chest. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "We know exactly what's going on. You've been sneaking around with my wife for months, planning to disappear like none of this matters. You're a coward." Greg's eyes flared, and he took a step closer, his posture menacing. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Scott. This isn't about an affair. You've got no clue about what's really going on." I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Jessie was standing behind Greg, tears running down her face, looking like she was trapped between us and the man she had chosen. It was like watching a nightmare play out in slow motion. I wanted to shake her, scream at her to explain herself, but something in Greg's voice, his tone, the way he seemed on the verge of losing control, froze me in place. "Tell him, Jessie," Greg demanded, his voice suddenly icy. "Tell him why you're really leaving." Jessie's lips trembled, and she looked down at the floor. She didn't say anything. "Tell him," Greg shouted, his voice cracking. Melissa took a step closer to me, her face twisted with confusion and fear. "Scott, what is he talking about?" I shook my head, trying to piece it together. This didn't make any sense. What could Jessie possibly be hiding that was worse than the affair? I opened my mouth to say something, But then Jessie finally spoke up, her voice barely a whisper.
I'm pregnant.
The words hit me like a freight train. For a moment, everything went silent. I felt like the ground was tilting beneath me, the weight of her words sinking in like a stone dropped into the ocean. What? I stammered, my throat dry. I'm pregnant, she repeated, her voice louder now, but still laced with fear. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for some kind of understanding.
And it's not yours, Scott.
It's Greg's.
The room spun.
I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying.
Pregnant?
With Greg's baby?
How long had she known?
How long had they been planning this?
No, this can't be happening, I muttered, my voice cracking.
I stumbled backward, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. Scott, I'm sorry, Jessie cried, stepping forward, but I couldn't even look at her. My mind was in a tailspin, replaying every moment, every lie she'd told, every time she'd smiled at me, knowing she was carrying another man's child.
How long?
I finally asked, my voice trembling with anger. How long have you known? Jessie wiped her eyes, looking down at the floor again. A few weeks. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought maybe it wouldn't come to this, but... But what, Jessie? I snapped, my anger boiling over. You thought you could just run off with him and leave me here like some kind of idiot? You thought you could hide this forever.
She didn't answer.
I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch something, anything, to release the rage building inside me.
But I couldn't move.
I was paralyzed by the betrayal, the sheer cruelty of it all. Melissa looked equally horrified, her mouth hanging open in shock. You're pregnant, with Greg's baby, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oh my God, Jessie. Greg, meanwhile, stood there with his arms crossed, looking smug. Like he'd won some twisted game.
Yes, Scott. That's right.
She's carrying my child. That's why we're leaving. You really thought she'd stick around for you when she's got a future with me. The arrogance in his voice sent a fresh wave of rage through me. I clenched my fists, ready to lunge at him, but Melissa grabbed my arm, stopping me.
Scott, don't.
He's not worth it. I pulled away from her, glaring at Greg with pure hatred. You think you can just take everything from me? You think you can waltz into my life, destroy my marriage, and walk away like nothing happened? Greg smirked, shaking his head.
You've already lost, Scott.
You're just too blind to see it. I felt like I was going to explode. Everything I had built, everything I thought I knew, was crumbling around me, and Greg stood there like he was untouchable. But as I stared at him, something in my gut twisted. This wasn't just about Jessie anymore. This was about power.
Control.
Greg had manipulated both of us, me and Melissa, for months playing his little game, and now he was standing here, daring me to do something about it. And that's when I snapped. Without thinking, I lunged forward, grabbing Greg by the collar and shoving him back against the wall. You think you're untouchable, huh? I snarled, my face inches from his. You think you can destroy people's lives and just walk away? Greg's smug expression faltered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure.
Go ahead, Scott. Hit me.
See how far that gets you. I was breathing heavily, my knuckles white as I held him against the wall.
But I knew he was right.
Hitting him wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't bring back the life I thought I had. It wouldn't erase the fact that Jessie had chosen him. I let go of him, stepping back, my chest heaving with anger and frustration. Greg straightened his shirt, smirking at me again like he'd won. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Scott, let's go, Melissa said quietly, her voice steady but filled with pain. There's nothing left to say. I looked at Jessie one last time, hoping to see some sign of regret, some flicker of the woman I thought I loved. But all I saw was fear.
Fear and guilt.
She had already made her choice, and there was no going back. I turned and walked out of the house, Melissa following close behind. As soon as we were outside, the weight of everything hit me like a ton of bricks. I bent over, gasping for air, my body shaking with the force of the emotions I had been holding back. Melissa put a hand on my shoulder, her voice soft. Scott, I'm so sorry. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. As Melissa and I walked away from Greg's house, everything felt surreal. It was like I had been sleepwalking through my life, and now I was wide awake, but I couldn't wake up from the nightmare. My heart was shattered, and my mind kept looping back to the image of Jessie's tear-streaked face and Greg's smug, self-satisfied grin. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to burn everything to the ground, but instead, I felt numb. Empty. Melissa drove me back to my place. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? Our lives had both been torn apart by the same two people, and we were left with nothing but the wreckage. As we pulled up in front of my house, she finally broke the silence.
Scott.
I don't even know what to do now, she admitted, her voice shaky. Greg was my whole world. I built everything with him, and now it's all gone. I nodded, staring blankly out the window.
Yeah, same here.
But I guess we both know now that they were never really ours, huh? She sighed, resting her head on the steering wheel for a moment.
I guess not.
For a while, we just sat there in silence, neither of us ready to face what came next. Eventually, I thanked her for everything, for standing by me through this mess, for helping me uncover the truth, and I got out of the car. I didn't feel like myself as I walked up the steps to my house. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It was just a shell. An empty space filled with memories of a life that had never really been mine. I opened the front door, half expecting to see Jessie sitting on the couch, pretending like nothing had happened. But of course, the house was empty. Quiet. Cold. I collapsed onto the couch, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no making sense of it. No explanation that could ever justify what Jessie had done. She hadn't just cheated. She had destroyed our entire life together. She had gotten pregnant with another man's baby, planned to run off and leave me without even looking back. How could someone be so cruel? How could someone I thought I knew so well turn out to be a complete stranger? I sat there for hours, lost in my thoughts, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. I didn't wake up until the next morning, and when I did, the emptiness inside me felt even heavier. That's when I noticed something on the kitchen counter.
A note.
It was from Jessie.
Scott.
I don't know how to explain everything that's happened, and I'm not going to ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I've made so many mistakes, and I know I've hurt you more than I could ever imagine. But you deserve to know why I did what I did. It wasn't just about Greg. Yes, I fell in love with him. And yes, I'm pregnant with his baby. But it wasn't like I woke up one day and decided to destroy everything we had. It was more complicated than that. I felt trapped for a long time, Scott. Trapped in a life that didn't feel like mine. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it's the truth. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to tell you that I wasn't happy anymore. I know that doesn't excuse anything. I know I've ruined everything, and I'll live with that for the rest of my life. But please believe me when I say that I didn't plan for things to end like this. I never meant for it to go this far. I'm leaving town with Greg. I know that's the last thing you want to hear, but it's the only choice I have left. We're starting over, somewhere far away. I hope one day you can find it in your heart to move on from this and find someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved.
Goodbye, Scott. Jessie.
The words blurred in front of my eyes as I read and reread the note.
She was gone. She had left me.
And she hadn't even had the guts to face me when she did it. A wave of nausea hit me as I crumpled the note in my fist, feeling the anger rise inside me again. After everything, she still found a way to justify her betrayal. She still made it about her, about how she felt trapped, how she wasn't happy. As if that somehow excused the lies, the cheating, the pregnancy, the secret plans to run away. I stood up, pacing around the kitchen, trying to calm myself down. I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let this break me. But no matter how hard I tried to push the emotions down, they kept flooding back. The pain, the anger, the helplessness. And then, in the midst of it all, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Melissa. Melissa, Scott, I think you should know something. Greg didn't show up at the airport this morning. I don't know where he is. Jessie might be waiting for him, but something feels off. I stared at the text, my stomach churning. Greg didn't show up? Was he backing out? Had he changed his mind at the last minute? For a split second, I felt a weird sense of hope. Maybe Jessie was about to get the same betrayal she had inflicted on me. Maybe Greg had bailed on her, leaving her stranded and alone, just like she had planned to leave me. But then the reality of it hit me. None of this was going to make anything better. No matter what happened between Greg and Jessie, the damage was already done. My life was already in pieces. I texted Melissa back, telling her I didn't care what Greg did anymore. He could rot for all I cared. Jessie had made her choice, and now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces of my life without her. But even as I sent that message, a dark thought crept into my mind. What if something more had happened? What if Greg hadn't just bailed on her? What if this whole thing was going to end even worse than I'd imagined? Later that night, as I sat in the silence of my empty house, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Melissa.
It was the police.
They found Greg's body near the river. Turns out, Jessie didn't run away with Greg. She had killed him. They said it looked like a domestic dispute gone wrong. That Jesse had confronted him about something at the last minute, and things had escalated.
She'd snapped.
I guess all the lies and deceit had finally caught up to her, and when Greg didn't play along with her fantasy, she lost it. Now she was in custody, and everything was over. Just like that.
That's the end.
There's no happy ending here.
No redemption.
Just two broken people who tore each other, and everyone around them, apart. I never got closure. I never got justice. And as much as I hate to admit it, I still can't stop thinking about her. Sometimes the worst kind of ending is the one where you never really escape.